Hello out there again, maybe. Feel free to skip this intro if you've been here before and you know what these videos are going to be about. So I highly doubt that there'll be much interest, if any, in these videos, but it was a useful project from my point of view. When I was looking at upgrading my old perpetual version of Lightroom 5.7, which was released way back in 2014. And before going down the Adobe subscription route, because I was very anti-subscription for a long time, hence why I've stuck with Lightroom 5.7 for such a long time, I wanted to just check to see whether there was any other software options out there that would give me the same functionality as Lightroom moving forward. So I explored quite a lot of software, and I'll just scroll through the list again now, just trying to find that software that I might have overlooked in the past, just to see how well they compared to Lightroom. And for this project, I was mainly just interested in seeing what starting positions each of the software that I tried offered up, because obviously in all packages you can edit images to your heart's content to get it to a point that you're happy with to achieve your vision. But for a quick workflow, it would be great if the software rendered your image in a way that was pleasing, so you didn't then have to spend minutes or hours editing the image to get it to where you wanted it to go. The reason why I was considering Adobe in the first place is I wanted to speed up and simplify my workflow, because obviously my old version of Lightroom was no longer compatible with some of the newer cameras I had, certainly not the Fujifilm X-H1. So as I mentioned in this video, which is the precursor to this series of videos, I eventually ended up going with an Adobe subscription, but I didn't really want my thoughts on the software that I trialed to go to waste, hence why I came up with the idea of this series of videos, because hopefully there might be some people out there, hopefully, that are in a similar position to me and want to explore other software options before subscribing to Adobe or Capture One or whatever, just to see what I thought of them, and especially if you haven't got the time or the patience to do a similar exercise in terms of comparing all of these programs. So yeah, I'll briefly talk about my thoughts of the actual programs when I trialed them, in terms of whether I actually liked the software, what I liked, what I didn't like about the software, how it compared to Lightroom, for instance, and the occasional rant about certain software, as well as hopefully some interesting tidbits in there somewhere, maybe. Yeah, so then I'll jump into the comparisons and I'll compare the images, the straight images, so literally just taking it into the software, apply the appropriate starting profile or preset, and then export them out, put them into Lightroom so I can compare them easily with Lightroom's own efforts and with the software that I liked the best in terms of rendering each scene from each camera. And finally, I will add my thoughts on using Adobe Lightroom Classic, because I've been running this project now for nearly a year. So I've been using Adobe Lightroom for about 9 months now. So I will certainly offer up my thoughts on my experiences thus far. So let's get started for the first time, or get on with the comparisons if you've been here before. Right, onto a piece of software I didn't really know existed before I started doing this comparison, and that is CyberLink PhotoDirector. And overall, this doesn't do too bad of a job, and in retrospect you could argue that sometimes it does produce a better starting position than those that I originally chose as my favourite starting point, but its use is not consistent enough in terms of the results it produces, and it's not that great with the Canon 5D RAW files or the Fuji X-H1 files. So again, this one probably does the best in terms of matching irradiance, certainly in terms of you can make out some of the detail and colour in the sky, like that's irradiance there. So irradiance is still better, but CyberLink did a pretty good job. It did a bit of a dark effort on this one, matching the exposure of Lightroom's, but again, I think the tonality is very similar to that of Radiant in this particular image. It's just a shame it lacks a little bit of that punch that the Radiant version offers up. So onto Olympus files. This is an interesting image here in that it is different to what Wall Therapy and Lightroom have interpreted, but it offers up an alternative. I wouldn't say it lacks contrast, it's just the tonality, the colouring is just a lot more softer. It's just a different take, and I actually quite like this take on this particular image. So moving on to the Fuji X-H1 files. So again, actually, I think it does do a good job here with the tonality. It may be a little bit flat, you know, it needs a little bit more separation between the various elements in the photos compared to what Luminar is able to do. But yeah, on the whole, I think tonality-wise, it did do a really good job. That's Lightroom's horrible effort in this particular scene. Just the greens are just, for me, a bit too fake. Whereas the CyberLink and the Luminar do a better job. However, this is where the inconsistency creeps in, because this is the favoured image for this particular scene from another Wall Therapy, whereas this is CyberLink's horrible effort, and it just looks completely fake in comparison, and it's nowhere near as good as Lightroom's rendition either. And then moving on to the Canon 5D images, again, it does do a reasonable job, although again it's lacking a little bit of that punch that the other software provides in this scenario. Right, so on to Darktable. You get a nice image of its user interface here. I say user interface, I don't actually find it that intuitive to use. And I wasn't even going to try this one, but there did seem to be a lot of traffic out there in terms of its good results that people were achieving with it. However, my experience doesn't really chime with others, it seems. It didn't like my Fuji X-E1 images. That was the case even when I tried to use a different starting profile or starting curve. And with my other camera types as well, the results were a bit hit or miss. Sometimes they were way off, sometimes it did produce a nice natural tonality to the image. Yeah, but overall, I haven't really got a lot of positive things to say about Darktable, other than the fact that it's one of the very few free options in the software that I tried. The others that I've talked about so far that have been free was Adobe's digital negative converter and also Canon's DPP if you've got a Canon camera to use it with. So Darktable is free, but I didn't really find the results to be that great. I obviously also tried editing an image in the software, but I just can't see me wanting to continue using Darktable, primarily because the results weren't good enough, and also the learning curve in getting to grips with the software is extremely steep. I just didn't find it as intuitive as other software that I tried, so I seriously doubt that I'll be using Darktable again. So let's just have a look at some of the images that I did end up keeping for comparison purposes. So all the X-E1 images are gone because they were just unusable, and you can see here with these Olympus files, they just lack a little bit of contrast. They just provide a bit of a flat perspective compared to the other images, although like I said here, it does seem to produce a very natural tonality to some of the images. I just didn't really find it was a look overall that I liked looking at. And again, like Capture One, I'm not a fan of the software from a usability perspective. So again, it didn't really do that well with the X-H1 files. It produced a very, very flat and dark image. Maybe that's its idea. It has a dark image in which you can then push hard to achieve your final vision for the image. But I think from my point of view, I prefer a more neutral starting position so I can get a sense of what, if anything, I need to do to the image to get it to a finished point. So, and then again with the Canon 5D images, it just didn't like these raw files at all. Similarly to the X-H1, they just produced a very flat image compared to other software that I've tried. And like I said, maybe that's its intention. So that was Darktable. Goodbye. Right, so on to DxO's PhotoLab 3, 5 and 6. Well, I have DX PhotoLab 3, but unfortunately this doesn't support any of Fuji's cameras. Well, none of the X-Trans sensor cameras. Anyway, and then during the trial, I tried DxO's PhotoLab 5, and then 6 was released, so I ended up trying all 3 iterations. And there's no denying that PhotoLab's Deep Prime noise reduction tool is extremely effective. It can really rescue noisy images in a smart way, and I was considering at one point purchasing the software, but then Adobe released their AI denoise functionality for Lightroom, which I find to be just as good, if not a little slower in operation. And I'm sure that's Adobe Lightroom's first go at the AI denoise functionality, so I'm sure over time it will improve. So with PhotoLab as well, like I said, I do like the way that it reduces noise through that Deep Prime tool. There's some other tools as well that you can just click on and off, like their smart lighting and the clear view. If I just demonstrate that quickly, this is admittedly PhotoLab 3, but the interface is broadly similar with the newer tools. So you've got DxO smart lighting functionality here, and what I like about it is you can just click on it and it will work its magic. So you can then see whether you want to keep that or not, or vary the intensity. And then coupled with DxO's Clear View Plus, I find that its initial go is normally too aggressive, but again you can just slide that back like so. And I do find that those two tools are probably one of the main reasons that I do admire PhotoLab, because you can quickly make adjustments to files without really moving many of the other sliders traditionally found in the likes of Lightroom. Of course, you've got those sliders as well if you want to make further adjustments, but I find that these two tools give your images a great starting point to then refine if need be. One thing I don't really like about PhotoLab is that I do find it's quite an expensive piece of software. Not quite as expensive as Capture One, and you don't need to pay for a rolling subscription. Now, if you bought DxO's PhotoLab 6 Elite Edition, which you need for that Deep Prime denoising functionality, it costs about £200. You can get it slightly cheaper when they release a Black Friday deal, normally around October time. And I probably wouldn't buy it at the moment anyway, because I'm sure they're prepping PhotoLab 7 for release, because that's my bugbear with these companies that don't offer a subscription. They tend to release new software every year anyway, and then all development on the software that you just bought a year ago stops, and then you have to pay extra to upgrade to the next iteration of the software. And generally I don't really find that the changes are that significant to justify upgrading each year, and then of course if you leave it a couple years, that cost of upgrade is more again. So I do think you need to look at the pricing, because sometimes, even though I was anti-subscription for many years, I do think overall it works out is good value for money, especially if you can get a deal for those subscription-based software packages. And like I said, whilst I do like using the smart lighting, the Deep Prime and the Clear View Plus tools within the software, I do on the whole struggle to achieve a natural looking image with PhotoLab. I find that it's generally too easy to be achieved an over sharpened or a fake looking image with the sliders. Like if you left that Clear View Plus in its default position, it doesn't look real, and so there is more of a risk, I find, with PhotoLab compared to other software like Lightroom to get a natural looking image after doing a bit of post-processing within the software. I also found as well with my Fuji X-E1 files that the tonality is slightly off, and we'll take a look at some of the comparisons in a minute, although I will say that I found that PhotoLab 6 was much better at Fuji RAW files than when I tried PhotoLab 5, which is when they first, I believe, brought in compatibility with Fuji X-Trans sensor cameras. So that is a positive in that they are moving in the right direction. I also found that the latest version of PhotoLab 6, was extremely snappy to use compared to Lightroom, which I do find to be a little sluggish. Yeah, so I found it really quick to use. It's got a really nice clean interface, a nice user interface, and it's easy to use. And I also found that the exports, when you finish your processing, were quick in my opinion. It's just a shame on the negatives that I've brought up, and the fact that perhaps it didn't really provide for me a consistent, decent starting position. So let's just have a look at some of the comparisons. So this is the Fuji X-E1 files to begin with, and of course it didn't have this compatibility in PhotoLab 3. So I've just got PhotoLab 5's attempt, then we've got PhotoLab 6 attempt, so you can see that it does have some improvements baked into its rendering of Fuji X-E1 RAW files. So then this is Lightroom's efforts, and then this is my Ode Irradiant version 1.68 attempt at rendering, which I do find overall to be better, because if we just take a quick look between these two, with PhotoLab on the left and Irradiant on the right, I just find that it's just, yeah, it just has something magical about it, which is why I like the X-E1 camera in the first place. Sometimes the files do have something more about them, and I find that Irradiant definitely helps to bring that magic out. Right, so this is the original RAW file in Lightroom. This is DXO's PhotoLab 5, and the winning rendering was from DXO's PhotoLab 6. It just manages to bring out a lot more of the detail. The colouring seemed to be on point, and yeah, overall I thought PhotoLab did a great job with this image. Right, so let's just move on to the other Fuji files a minute. So now on to the XH1. So this is PhotoLab 5, this is PhotoLab 6. So you can see definitely a difference in the rendering between these two versions. And then we have Lightroom's efforts, and then my favoured effort in this round was from Luminar. I just found overall that the green tonality was a little bit better compared with other software. So if we look at PhotoLab 6, you can see that it is quite green heavy, whereas Luminar does manage, I find, to extract some different greens in amongst all of that green in the background in this particular image. So let's move on to the final XH1 image, so the telephone box. So this is my favoured rendering, which is from another RAW therapy. So let's just have a quick look at the RAW file in Lightroom, and that's how it renders it. So quite a bit of a difference. So let's have a look at what PhotoLab does. So that's PhotoLab 5, and that's PhotoLab 6. So again, you can see the PhotoLab 6 does a much better job than PhotoLab 5. And I could argue, I think I prefer it to Lightroom in this case, but I think I prefer another RAW therapy best, because I feel that it's just something more natural feeling about the image compared to PhotoLab's attempts. Obviously this is pre-applying any kind of edits, none of the smart lighting, none of the clear view plus, nothing. So other than probably its Previa profile within the software. Right, so let's take a look at some images from my other cameras. So this was from my Olympus. So if we start from the RAW file, so that's a RAW file. I'm not a massive fan of the greens. So again, my PhotoLab 3 is compatible with this camera here. So that's PhotoLab 3. That's PhotoLab 5, no difference. And then that's PhotoLab 6. So like I said, it's not really consistent here. I don't find it that great with my Olympus files. And then in this one, I do prefer Raw Therapy, although latterly, doing this comparison, I do think that Capture One did do a pretty good job as well. Right, so then moving on to the final image of my Olympus comparisons. So let's look at the raw file from Lightroom. So that's Lightroom's effort. That's PhotoLab 3, so it's horrible compared to the Lightroom image. And let's look at PhotoLab 5, so no difference. And then PhotoLab 6. So there's definitely a little bit of an improvement in the image here, but it's nothing as, it's kind of similar to Lightroom's effort, but my favorite was from Raw Therapy. Yes, it's a little bit darker, but I do find on the whole that Raw Therapy manages to extract a lot much more detail in the sky. And I guess again as well, you could bring that back in PhotoLab with a little bit more effort, but it's amazing how much more detail Raw Therapy has managed to just offer up from just loading the file in and then exporting it with no other edits. So that's the Olympus files. Let's have a look at the Canon 5D files. So that's the Lightroom's attempt. So that's PhotoLab 3. That's PhotoLab 5, no difference. And then that's PhotoLab 6. So definitely a lot better than the previous versions of the software. And if we look at my favoured software here, again it's Raw Therapy. So you can see it's not too bad actually, it's a little bit lighter, but I just feel that Raw Therapy really puts in a good show for Canon 5D files. And then moving on to the last Canon 5D image. So again, that's Lightroom's effort. That's PhotoLab 3, PhotoLab 5. So it just goes to show you, this goes back to my point about paying for upgrades. Between DXO's 3, 4 and 5, there was no really any improvement to the image quality if you just owned a Canon 5D camera, whereas PhotoLab 6, it does seem to be a lot more improvements to the rendering engine of the software, but not quite as good as Lightroom. But I do feel that Lightroom perhaps is a little bit on the fake blue color. I would have to kind of tone that a little bit back in post-processing. But yeah, I'm not quite sure I like PhotoLab's coloring in that either. So that's DXO's PhotoLab 3, 5 and 6. Right, so that's the end of this part. I hope some of it is at least interesting or useful to you. Thanks for sticking with it to the end. See you next week for more of the same until this series is done. Bye for now.